Glenn Beck thought he had found the perfect target. The conservative media personality, known for his theatrical commentary and willingness to mock his political opponents, decided to dedicate an entire segment of his show to ridiculing Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. He played clips of her speeches, used exaggerated voices to imitate her, and suggested that she represented everything wrong with the Democratic Party. His audience laughed along, and Beck clearly believed he had scored another easy victory in the culture war battles that define his media empire. But what happened next caught Glenn Beck completely off guard. Within hours of his segment airing, Jasmine Crockett delivered a response that not only dismantled his mockery, but exposed the deeper issues with the kind of political commentary Beck represents. Her response was so effective, so precisely targeted, and so devastating in its impact that Beck found himself on the defensive for the first time in years. The viral spread of her response forced Beck into an uncomfortable position where his usual tactics of deflection and further mockery simply did not work. The confrontation revealed something important about the changing dynamics of political discourse in America. The old model where conservative commentators could mock progressive politicians without consequence was breaking down, replaced by a new reality where those politicians could respond directly to millions of people and turn the tables on their critics. What Beck intended as entertainment for his base became a lesson in why underestimating your opponents based on partisan assumptions can backfire spectacularly. Before we break down exactly what Beck said, how Crockett responded, and why her response was so effective, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on these crucial political moments. Now let us dive into how Jasmine Crockett turned Glenn Beck's mockery into a masterclass on political communication, and why his response left him looking weaker than ever before. Understanding this confrontation requires knowing who Glenn Beck is and what role he plays in conservative media. Beck rose to prominence as a Fox News host before launching his own media network, The Blaze. He built his brand on emotional appeals, conspiracy theories, and theatrical presentations that often featured props, chalkboards covered in connecting lines, and tearful warnings about the direction of America. Beck represents a particular strain of conservative commentary that prioritizes entertainment value and emotional engagement over policy analysis or factual accuracy. Over the years, Beck has made a career out of mocking progressive politicians, particularly women of color who advocate for liberal policies. His approach typically involves playing clips out of context, using dismissive language, and encouraging his audience to view these politicians as foolish or dangerous. This strategy works well within the conservative media ecosystem, where audiences are primed to accept negative characterizations of Democratic politicians without demanding evidence or context. Beck's audience is substantial and deeply loyal. They tune in expecting validation of their political beliefs and entertainment that reinforces their worldview. For Beck, mocking someone like Jasmine Crockett serves multiple purposes. It provides content that his audience enjoys. It positions him as a fearless truth-teller willing to take on the political establishment, and it generates engagement that translates into ratings and revenue. The mockery is not really about Crockett herself, but about what she represents to Beck's audience: young, progressive, vocal, and unapologetic. On the other side of this confrontation stands Jasmine Crockett, who represents a fundamentally different approach to political communication. As we have established in previous discussions, Crockett came to Congress after years as a civil rights attorney and public defender. Her communication style was forged in courtrooms where emotional appeals matter, but facts and evidence ultimately determine outcomes. She understands how to construct arguments that resonate emotionally while remaining grounded in verifiable truth. Crockett also represents a generation of politicians who grew up with social media and understand how to use these platforms effectively. Unlike politicians from earlier eras who relied on traditional media gatekeepers to amplify their messages, Crockett can speak directly to millions of people instantly. This changes the power dynamics significantly. When Beck mocked her on his show, he was operating under the old assumption that she would either ignore the attack or respond through traditional channels that his audience would never see. He did not anticipate that she could, and would respond in ways that would reach far beyond his viewer base. The stakes of this particular confrontation extended beyond the personal reputations of Beck and Crockett. At issue was a broader question about the nature of political discourse and who gets to shape public narratives. Beck's mockery represented an attempt to delegitimize Crockett and the policies she advocates by portraying her as unserious or incompetent. If successful, this kind of attack makes it harder for politicians like Crockett to be taken seriously by moderate voters who might be persuaded by substantive arguments, but are influenced by cultural narratives about who is credible and who is not. Crockett understood that allowing Beck's mockery to go unanswered would reinforce those narratives. But she also understood that responding in the wrong way could backfire, making her look thin-skinned or unable to handle criticism. The challenge was to craft a response that would expose the dishonesty in Beck's attack while demonstrating the kind of competence and command that would make his mockery look foolish in retrospect. It was a delicate balance that required both strategic thinking and precise execution. The confrontation also highlighted the asymmetry in how different political figures are treated in media. Beck can mock Crockett with impunity on his platform, knowing his audience will applaud. But if Crockett were to respond in kind with personal mockery of Beck, she would likely face criticism for being unprofessional or petty. This double standard means that her response had to be substantive and dignified while still being effective at neutralizing his attack. The degree of difficulty was considerably higher for her than for him. Glenn Beck's segment on Jasmine Crockett followed a familiar pattern. He began by playing a clip of her speaking on the House floor about economic inequality, but he edited the clip to remove important context and make her arguments sound more extreme than they actually were. He then launched into his commentary, using exaggerated facial expressions and mocking tones to suggest that her concerns about wealth inequality were naive or socialist propaganda. Beck particularly focused on a moment where Crockett had cited statistics about the racial wealth gap in America. He questioned whether these statistics were accurate, suggested that she was playing the race card, and implied that her focus on racial disparities was divisive rather than constructive. He did not actually fact-check her statistics or present alternative data. Instead, he relied on mockery and innuendo to create doubt about her credibility in the minds of his viewers. The segment continued with Beck bringing up Crockett's background as a public defender. He suggested that defending accused criminals had warped her perspective on law and order, and he questioned whether someone with that background should be making laws. He implied that her legal experience defending the accused made her soft on crime and out of touch with the concerns of law-abiding citizens. Again, he offered no evidence for these characterizations, relying instead on his audience's pre-existing assumptions about criminal defense attorneys and progressive politicians. Beck also mocked Crockett's speaking style, imitating what he characterized as her dramatic delivery, and suggesting that she was more interested in creating viral moments than in serious legislating. He played several clips of her questioning witnesses in committee hearings, editing them to make her appear aggressive or unreasonable. He joked that she seemed to think she was still in a courtroom rather than in Congress, implying that she had not adjusted to the norms and expectations of legislative work. The segment reached its peak when Beck directly addressed his audience with a warning about politicians like Crockett. He suggested that she represented a new breed of Democratic politician who was more concerned with social media fame than with actual governing. He characterized her as someone who prioritized performance over policy and who used identity politics to avoid having to defend her positions on the merits. He encouraged his viewers to see her as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the Democratic Party. Throughout the segment, Beck's audience could be heard laughing at his jokes and applauding his critiques. The segment was designed to be entertaining for his base while simultaneously delegitimizing Crockett as a serious political figure. Beck clearly believed he had delivered a successful piece of political commentary that would resonate with his viewers and potentially damage Crockett's reputation beyond his immediate audience. What Beck failed to anticipate was how quickly news of his segment would spread beyond his own platform. Progressive activists and Crockett supporters began sharing clips of Beck's mockery on social media, expressing outrage at what they characterized as racist and sexist attacks disguised as political commentary. The hashtag Beck vs. Crockett began trending, with people calling for Crockett to respond and defend herself against what they saw as unfair characterizations. Media outlets picked up on the story, framing it as another example of the intensifying cultural and political divisions in America. Some conservative commentators defended Beck, arguing that political figures should be able to withstand criticism and mockery. Some progressive commentators attacked Beck, characterizing his segment as representative of the disrespect that women of color in politics routinely face from conservative media. As the story gained traction, pressure mounted on Crockett to respond. Some advisors counseled ignoring Beck entirely, arguing that responding would only give him more attention and feed into a cycle of confrontation that would distract from her legislative work. Others argued that remaining silent would allow Beck's characterizations to stand unchallenged and potentially influence how moderate voters perceived her. The debate within Democratic circles reflected a broader uncertainty about how to handle attacks from conservative media figures who operate outside the boundaries of traditional journalistic standards. Crockett watched Beck's segment multiple times, taking notes on his specific claims and the techniques he used to misrepresent her positions. She consulted with her communications team about the best approach, weighing the risks and benefits of different response strategies. She understood that whatever she said would be scrutinized, not just by Beck and his audience, but by a much broader public that was watching to see how she handled this kind of attack. The decision about whether and how to respond carried significant implications. A weak response would confirm Beck's portrayal of her as unable to defend her positions. An overly aggressive response would allow him to claim he had gotten under her skin and to position himself as a victim of liberal intolerance. The response needed to be calibrated perfectly, strong enough to neutralize his attack, but measured enough to maintain her credibility with audiences beyond the progressive base. Jasmine Crockett chose to respond through a video posted directly to her social media accounts, ensuring that her message would reach audiences far beyond Glenn Beck's viewership. The video, which ran about 6 minutes, demonstrated a masterful understanding of how to turn an opponent's attack into an opportunity for effective communication. From the opening seconds, it was clear that this would not be a defensive or reactive response, but rather a strategic dismantling of both Beck's specific attacks and the broader tactics he represented. Crockett began by thanking Beck for the attention, noting that his segment had introduced her and her work to many people who might not have been familiar with her previously. This opening immediately reframed the dynamic, suggesting that she viewed his attack as an opportunity rather than a threat. It was a power move that signaled she would not be playing defense in this exchange. She then addressed Beck's editing of her floor speech about economic inequality. She played the full clip, unedited, showing the context that Beck had removed. She pointed out specific places where his editing had changed the meaning of her statements, and she explained why that context mattered for understanding her actual position. This was not an emotional complaint about being treated unfairly, but rather a factual demonstration of dishonest media practices. She let the evidence speak for itself. Regarding the statistics Beck had questioned about racial wealth gaps, Crockett pulled out documentation from multiple sources including the Federal Reserve, academic research institutions, and government agencies. She did not just assert that her statistics were correct, but showed exactly where they came from and explained the methodology behind them. She noted that Beck had questioned her numbers without offering any alternative data, and she invited him to provide evidence if he believed her sources were unreliable. It was a direct challenge that exposed the emptiness of his criticism. On the issue of her background as a public defender, Crockett delivered what may have been the most powerful portion of her response. She explained that defending people accused of crimes was not about being soft on crime, but about ensuring that the constitutional rights of all Americans are protected. She described cases where she had defended innocent people who would have been wrongly convicted without adequate legal representation. She talked about the importance of the presumption of innocence and the right to counsel. Then she turned the tables completely. She pointed out that many of the founding fathers that conservatives like Beck claimed to revere were attorneys who defended unpopular clients. John Adams defended British soldiers after the Boston Massacre. Was Adams soft on crime, or was he upholding principles that are fundamental to American justice? The comparison was devastating because it used conservative reverence for the founders to validate the very work Beck had mocked. Crockett then addressed Beck's mockery of her speaking style and committee questioning. She showed clips of her asking tough questions that had revealed important information or held powerful people accountable. She pointed out that effective oversight requires asking hard questions and not accepting non-responsive answers. She noted that if Beck preferred members of Congress who asked softball questions and accepted whatever they were told, that said more about his view of government accountability than about her approach to legislating. She also addressed the broader accusation that she was more interested in viral moments than in serious work. She walked through several pieces of legislation she had introduced or co-sponsored, explaining their purpose and impact. She discussed committee work that never made headlines, but involved detailed policy development. She showed that the viral moments Beck was mocking represented a small fraction of her actual work, and that his focus on those moments, while ignoring her substantive legislative contributions, was itself a form of dishonesty. But the most effective part of Crockett's response came when she addressed Beck's broader characterization of her as a divisive figure who played identity politics. She acknowledged that she frequently discusses issues of race and inequality in her work. Then she explained why. She cited statistics about disparities in education, healthcare, criminal justice, and economic opportunity. She asked whether acknowledging these realities constituted divisive identity politics, or whether ignoring them would be a failure of her responsibility to represent her constituents. She pointed out that Beck himself had made her race and gender central to his mockery, even as he accused her of playing identity politics. She noted that women of color in politics routinely face a double bind, where discussing issues that disproportionately affect their communities is characterized as divisive, while remaining silent would be characterized as not advocating for their constituents. She asked Beck to explain which issues she should be allowed to discuss, and which ones were off limits, because they might make some people uncomfortable. The conclusion of Crockett's video shifted from defending herself to making a broader point about political discourse. She said that the kind of mockery Beck had engaged in might be entertaining for his audience, but it degraded public debate and made it harder to address serious problems facing the country. She noted that disagreement on policy is healthy and necessary in democracy, but that misrepresenting opponents' positions and mocking them personally rather than engaging with their arguments is destructive. She ended with a direct challenge to Beck. She said that if he truly believed her positions were wrong, she would welcome an actual debate where they could discuss the merits of different policy approaches. She said she was confident that her positions could withstand scrutiny if evaluated honestly. But she noted that she doubted Beck would accept such a debate because his business model depended on mockery and misrepresentation rather than substantive engagement. The video went viral immediately, racking up millions of views within hours. The response across social media was overwhelmingly positive, with people praising Crockett for the effectiveness of her response and the way she had turned Beck's attack into an opportunity to discuss substantive issues. Legal experts and constitutional scholars praised her defense of public defenders and the criminal justice system. Policy analysts noted that her explanation of her legislative work provided a model for how politicians could communicate complex policy issues to broad audiences. The immediate impact of Crockett's response was dramatic and multifaceted. Within the first 24 hours, her video had been viewed more than 10 times as many people as typically watch Glenn Beck's show. It had been shared by major political figures, celebrities, and media personalities across the political spectrum. Even some conservative commentators acknowledged that her response had been effective and that Beck had underestimated his target. Glenn Beck himself was put in an extremely uncomfortable position. His initial instinct was to double down, to mock Crockett's response, and dismiss it as proving his point about her being more interested in viral moments than in substance. But this approach immediately backfired. When he tried to claim that her response was all style and no substance, people pointed to the detailed policy discussion and factual documentation she had provided. When he suggested she was being overly sensitive to legitimate criticism, people highlighted the dishonest editing and misrepresentation he had engaged in. Beck eventually posted a response on his own social media, but it was notably more defensive than his usual confident pronouncements. He claimed that he had been taken out of context, which many observers found ironic given that Crockett had demonstrated exactly how he had taken her out of context. He said that he stood by his criticism of her policies, but acknowledged that perhaps his presentation could have been more focused on substance. It was as close to an admission of error as Beck's brand would allow, and it was widely interpreted as a sign that Crockett's response had landed effectively. The confrontation generated extensive media coverage that went far beyond the usual partisan news outlets. Mainstream media organizations covered the exchange as a story about changing dynamics in political communication and the challenges of combating misinformation in an era of partisan media. Academic experts weighed in on the tactics both sides had used and the effectiveness of Crockett's response strategy. Media literacy organizations used the exchange as a case study in how to identify and respond to dishonest editing and misrepresentation. For Crockett herself, the episode further elevated her national profile and reinforced her reputation as someone who could hold her own against any opponent. Democratic organizations began featuring her more prominently in fundraising appeals and messaging campaigns, recognizing that she had demonstrated an ability to turn attacks into opportunities. Her social media following grew substantially, giving her a larger platform for communicating directly with voters about the issues she cares about. The response also had implications for how other progressive politicians thought about handling attacks from conservative media figures. For years, the conventional wisdom had been that engaging with these attacks often made things worse by giving them more oxygen. Crockett had demonstrated an alternative approach: respond decisively with facts and substance, use the attention to communicate your actual positions, and turn the confrontation into an opportunity to reach new audiences. Other politicians began studying her response and adapting similar strategies for their own situations. Conservative media figures became noticeably more careful about how they discussed Crockett after this episode. While criticism of her positions continued, the kind of personal mockery and misrepresentation that Beck had engaged in became less common. The reason was simple: she had shown that such attacks could backfire, and that she had both the skills and the platform to make attackers look foolish. The risk-reward calculation had changed. The episode also sparked broader discussions about the role of media literacy in democracy. Educators began using the exchange to teach students about how to identify dishonest editing, how to verify claims, and how to distinguish between substantive policy disagreement and bad faith attacks. The fact that Crockett had so methodically demonstrated Beck's dishonest tactics made the example particularly valuable for educational purposes. Civil rights organizations and advocacy groups for women in politics highlighted the exchange as an example of the particular challenges that women of color face in political life. They noted that the kind of mockery Beck had engaged in, which focused on Crockett's appearance, speaking style, and identity as much as her positions, was part of a pattern of disrespect that female politicians, and particularly women of color, routinely encounter. Crockett's effective response provided a template for how to confront such treatment without being diminished by it. The long-term implications of the confrontation continue to unfold. For Glenn Beck, the episode marked a rare moment of public defeat that damaged his carefully cultivated image of always being in control of the narrative. While his core audience remained loyal, his ability to shape broader public opinion was diminished. The episode demonstrated the limits of the old model of conservative media dominance, where figures like Beck could say whatever they wanted without fear of effective contradiction. For the broader political landscape, the exchange illustrated how the power dynamics of political communication have shifted in the social media era. Politicians no longer depend on traditional media gatekeepers to amplify their messages. They can respond directly to attacks, present evidence to millions of people, and shape narratives in ways that were not possible a generation ago. This democratization of communication power has implications for how political battles are fought and won. The confrontation also highlighted the growing sophistication of progressive politicians in using communication tools effectively. Crockett's response was not just emotionally satisfying for her supporters, but strategically sound in ways that would resonate with persuadable voters. She combined moral clarity with factual rigor, emotional appeal with logical argumentation, and personal authenticity with political savvy. This combination represents a maturation of progressive political communication that makes it harder for conservatives to dominate the narrative through mockery and misrepresentation alone. Looking ahead, the question is whether this episode represents a turning point in how political discourse functions in America. Will more politicians adopt Crockett's approach of responding decisively to attacks with facts and substance? Will media figures like Beck adjust their tactics, or will they continue with approaches that have worked in the past even as they become less effective? Will audiences become more sophisticated about identifying dishonest media practices, or will partisan loyalties continue to trump factual accuracy? What is clear is that Jasmine Crockett has established herself as someone who cannot be easily dismissed or mocked without consequence. She has the skills, the platform, and the courage to fight back effectively against attacks from any source. Glenn Beck learned this lesson the hard way, and other potential critics have taken note. In an era where political communication increasingly happens outside traditional media structures, the ability to communicate directly and effectively with large audiences is a form of power that can neutralize traditional advantages. The exchange also serves as a reminder that substance still matters in political discourse, even in an age of short attention spans and viral moments. Crockett's response worked not just because it was well crafted, but because it was grounded in facts and evidence that could withstand scrutiny. The old approach of throwing out attacks and hoping some of them stick becomes less effective when targets can respond with documented refutations that reach comparable or larger audiences. If you want to stay informed about these critical moments in political communication and see more analysis of how politicians are adapting to the changing media landscape, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. The confrontation between traditional conservative media and the new generation of progressive politicians will continue to produce important moments that shape our political discourse. Understanding these dynamics is essential for anyone who wants to make sense of American politics in the social media age. Glenn Beck's attempt to mock Jasmine Crockett backfired completely, but the lessons from that failure will resonate far beyond the single exchange. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video with more in-depth political analysis.